People always say that the moment you find out you're pregnant, you feel this overwhelming rush of pure joy. And they're right. I did feel that. For about 48 hours, I felt it completely. Then my mother-in-law found out, and I learned what it actually means to be disposable to someone who was supposed to love you. I was 29 years old. I had been married to my husband for 3 years. We lived in a 4-bedroom house in Naperville, Illinois, about 40 minutes outside Chicago, in a neighborhood where every lawn was perfectly edged and every Christmas display was coordinated, and nobody ever talked about the ugly things happening behind their closed front doors. I worked as a forensic accountant for a mid-sized firm downtown. My husband worked for his family's commercial real estate development company, the kind of business that had been in his family for 2 generations and carried that particular weight that old family money always carries. The unspoken understanding that the business comes first, the family name comes second, and wives come somewhere after both. His mother had never liked me. I want to be honest about that from the beginning, because I think sometimes we tell ourselves stories about how things were fine until suddenly they weren't, and we miss all the signs we chose not to see. She had not liked me from the first dinner I attended at their home in Lake Forest, where everything was beige and cream and heavy with the specific quietness of inherited wealth. She had looked at me across the table that night with a smile that never quite reached her eyes and said, "We've heard so much about you," in a tone that made it clear she had heard enough and was already unimpressed. My husband's name is Calvin. His mother's name is Rosalind. I want you to hold those names in your mind, because everything that happens in this story happens because of who those 2 people decided to be when it mattered most. We had been trying to get pregnant for over a year. It wasn't a secret, exactly, but it wasn't something I broadcast either. I had 1 miscarriage at 11 weeks, early in our 2nd year of marriage, and the grief of that was something I carried mostly alone, because Calvin processed his feelings by getting very quiet, and Rosalind, when she found out, had said something about how these things happen for a reason in a way that made me want to never speak to her again. I didn't stop speaking to her. I smiled. I said thank you. I folded myself smaller to fit into the space they decided I could occupy. When I finally got a positive test on a Tuesday morning in March, I sat on the bathroom floor for a long time just breathing. Calvin was already at the office. I called my own mother in Cincinnati and cried happy tears on the phone with her for 20 minutes. She cried too. We made plans for her to visit once I hit the 2nd trimester. I felt, for the first time in a long time, like the ground beneath me was solid. That feeling lasted until Saturday. Calvin's family had a standing Saturday dinner tradition. His parents, his younger sister Petra, no wait, I need to use different names, his sister, his parents. The inner circle of a family that had spent 30 years building an identity around being a unit, which sounds lovely until you realize that the unit has no room in it for the women their sons choose to love. Calvin had insisted on telling his parents in person. He was proud and excited in the boyish way that made me remember why I had fallen in love with him in the first place. That genuine warmth that sometimes got buried under his need to keep everyone around him happy. I said yes. I wore a blue dress. I brought flowers for Rosalind, because I always brought flowers for Rosalind, because I was still, even then, trying. We sat in their formal dining room in Lake Forest with the chandelier overhead and the good china on the table, and Calvin reached over and took my hand and told them we were expecting. His father said congratulations and stood up to shake Calvin's hand. His sister smiled at me, a real smile, the kind that made me think we might have been friends in a different version of this family. Rosalind set down her fork. She looked at me the way you look at something you're trying to calculate. Quiet. Still. And then she said very calmly, "When exactly did this happen?" I told her. 8 weeks along. Due in late October. She nodded slowly. She picked up her fork again. She did not say congratulations. The rest of dinner was the kind of dinner where everyone pretends the strange thing didn't happen. Calvin talked about a development project in the west suburbs. His father asked about the due date again, genuinely this time, and said something about how it would be nice to have a grandchild before he got too old to enjoy it. Rosalind ate her salmon and smiled and contributed nothing, and I watched her the whole time from across the table, trying to read whatever was moving behind her eyes. After dinner, I went to find the bathroom, which was down the hallway past Rosalind's study. The door was slightly open, and I heard her on the phone. I wasn't trying to listen. I want to say that clearly, but I heard her say, "I need to know if the timing lines up," and then lower, "If she's actually pregnant, and if it's Calvin's, then everything changes." We need to move before the baby is born. I stood in that hallway for a moment that felt like it lasted an hour. Then I walked to the bathroom, washed my hands with their expensive soap, looked myself in the mirror, and made a decision. I was going to find out exactly what was happening. I was going to protect my child, and I was going to do it quietly, carefully, and completely on my own terms. What I didn't know yet was how far Rosalind was actually willing to go. Calvin's grandfather had built the family real estate company from nothing in the 1970s, starting with 2 commercial properties on the north side of Chicago and expanding through 40 years of work into a portfolio worth somewhere north of $40 million. When he died, 5 years before I married Calvin, he left a trust structure that his attorneys had spent considerable effort designing. The details were complicated, as these things always are, but the simplified version was this. The active management and majority financial benefit of the company passed to Rosalind and Calvin's father during their lifetimes, but a significant portion, nearly $18 million, was structured to pass to Calvin and any biological heirs he produced upon reaching certain conditions. The specific language in the trust documents, which I would eventually read very carefully, specified biological children of Calvin as the trigger for a significant distribution event. I did not know this when I married Calvin. I found out about the trust gradually, in pieces, over 3 years, the way you find out about most things in families like this. Through overheard comments and half-finished sentences, and the particular way Rosalind changed the subject whenever the company's financial structure came up. But I understood it now, standing in that hallway outside her study. If I produced a biological heir for Calvin, it would trigger a distribution that Rosalind had apparently been working very hard to prevent. I went back to work on Monday and started doing what I knew how to do. I am a forensic accountant. I find the story that numbers are trying to hide. I started asking questions quietly, pulling threads, doing research in the hours after Calvin fell asleep. I found a family law attorney in Chicago named, I'll call her my attorney. I found a forensic document specialist I had worked with professionally before and started a conversation about trust documents. I downloaded a secure storage app onto my phone and started keeping notes, recordings where legally permitted, documentation of everything. I also installed a small security camera on the covered porch of our house in Naperville, pointed at the driveway and front entrance. Calvin didn't notice. He was distracted by a big project deadline, working late most nights, trusting me to handle the household things because I always did. For 3 weeks, nothing happened. I went to my prenatal appointments. I felt the specific exhaustion of early pregnancy settle into my bones. I ate crackers and ginger candy and went to bed at 9 and thought about my child and tried to stay calm. Then my water bottle started tasting strange. It was subtle at first. A slightly bitter edge to water I had poured from the filter pitcher in our kitchen. I drank it, thought I was imagining things, poured it out and refilled it. Then it happened again. Then I noticed that I felt nauseated and dizzy in a way that felt different from pregnancy nausea, more sudden, more intense, not tied to smell or food the way morning sickness had been. I went to my obstetrician. I told her my symptoms. I asked her to run a comprehensive blood panel. I did not tell her why I was asking. The results came back with elevated levels of something they initially flagged as unusual for pregnancy. My OB referred me to a maternal fetal specialist. The specialist looked at my results and asked me a series of careful questions. I told her what I had noticed about the water. She ordered additional specific testing. What they found was a low-level accumulation of a compound found in certain pesticides and industrial cleaners. The kind of thing that would not cause acute illness in small doses, but would, over time and at higher concentrations, pose serious risk to a pregnancy and to the mother carrying it. Someone was putting something in my water. I did not tell Calvin. I want to explain that decision because I know how it sounds. He was my husband. He should have been the first person I told. But I had spent 3 weeks reviewing everything I could find about the trust structure, about the company's finances, about Rosalind's movements, and I had found something that made Calvin's position in all of this deeply unclear to me. There was a real estate transaction, a side deal, structured in a way that benefited Calvin directly in a manner that would no longer be necessary if the trust distribution occurred, that suggested he had a financial incentive to not become a father just yet. Whether he knew about what his mother was doing, or whether he was simply too obedient and too afraid to look, I honestly did not know. But I could not afford to find out the wrong way. I moved the water filter pitcher to a high cabinet and bought sealed bottled water. I documented everything. I gave a sample of the suspicious water to a private laboratory. I gave the lab results and my own medical records to my attorney. And then, because I needed to understand the full shape of what was happening, I called the forensic document specialist and told her I needed to look at the trust documents very carefully. What we found, over the next 2 weeks, was that someone, and the signature trail pointed clearly toward Rosalind, had been attempting to file paperwork with the trust's administrative bank that would reclassify certain distribution triggers. The paperwork was not yet finalized. It had not yet been accepted. But the attempt itself was a serious legal problem, potentially rising to the level of fraud and attempted trust manipulation. I added this to my file. My attorney added it to hers. The day everything broke open was not the day I had planned. Plans, I have learned, are things that hold you steady until reality decides to do something else entirely. Calvin came home on a Thursday evening looking rattled in a way I hadn't seen before. He sat down at the kitchen table and told me that his mother had called him that afternoon and told him she had concerns about the pregnancy. Specifically, and I watched his face very carefully as he said this, she had told him she didn't believe the baby was his. I sat across from him and waited. He said she had suggested a prenatal paternity test. He said he didn't believe her, not really, but that maybe it would be easier for everyone if. I said no, not because I had anything to hide. Because the request itself told me everything I needed to know about where Calvin was standing in all of this, and it wasn't next to me. He said he thought I was being unreasonable. His voice had the particular quality of someone repeating words that were given to him by someone else. I recognized the cadence of his mother in his sentences, the careful framing, the preloaded conclusions. I told him I needed a few days to think. I went upstairs. I called my attorney. I called my own mother. I packed a bag. The next morning, I went to stay with a colleague in Evanston, telling Calvin I needed space to process my feelings. This was true. It was also the cover I needed to let the next phase of what my attorney had set in motion proceed without me being in the house. What happened next happened quickly. My attorney, working with a family law specialist who had significant experience in trust litigation, filed an emergency motion in Cook County Circuit Court related to the attempted fraudulent modification of the trust documents. Simultaneously, the laboratory results from the water sample went to the Chicago police, along with my medical records. An investigator from the state's attorney's office was assigned to the case. Rosalind was interviewed at her home in Lake Forest on a Monday morning. By Monday afternoon, she had retained a criminal defense attorney. By Wednesday, based on the weight of the evidence my attorney had assembled over weeks of careful preparation, she was charged with attempted poisoning and attempted fraud in connection with the trust documents. Calvin called me 17 times that day. I let them all go to voicemail. When I finally called him back from my attorney's office with my attorney present, his voice had the specific quality of a man who has just discovered that the version of reality he has been living in is not the only version available. He kept saying he hadn't known. He kept saying his mother wouldn't, she couldn't. He said the word surely 3 times in a way that told me he was trying to convince himself more than me. I listened to all of it, and then I told him, very calmly, that I would be filing for divorce, that my attorney would be in contact with his, that our child, when born, would know their father if Calvin chose to show up as an actual father, and that I was done having conversations that required me to defend my own basic credibility to someone who was supposed to be my partner. He said, can we talk about this? I said, we are talking about it. This is the conversation. And I hung up. What came after was not easy. I want to be very clear about that because I think we do a disservice to people going through hard things when we skip over the middle part. The divorce proceedings took 14 months. There were depositions and document production and a custody evaluation and 2 different mediators before we got to a settlement that the family law judge finally approved. I threw up every morning for 16 weeks of pregnancy, partly from hormones and partly from stress, and I ate a lot of convenience store soup and called my mother too late at night, and sometimes sat on the floor of my colleague's guest bathroom in Evanston and just cried until I didn't have anything left. My daughter was born in October. She weighed 7 pounds, 2 ounces. She had Calvin's nose and my mother's eyes and a way of looking at the world from the very first day that made me feel like she had already decided she was going to be fine. I named her after my grandmother. Rosalind's criminal case moved through the courts over the following 18 months. The charge of attempted poisoning was difficult to prove to the criminal standard because the compound levels in my blood, while medically significant and clearly documented, left room for her defense attorneys to argue alternative explanations. That charge was ultimately reduced. But the fraud charge related to the trust documents was not. She was convicted and sentenced to 30 months in federal prison, with 3 years supervised probation to follow. The trust itself, once the fraudulent modification attempts were voided, distributed as Calvin's grandfather had originally intended. Because my daughter was Calvin's biological child, verified by the genetic testing that was part of the divorce proceedings, she qualified as a biological heir under the trust language. Calvin received his distribution. Part of that, under our divorce settlement, was structured to fund a dedicated account for our daughter's education and care. I am telling you this not because I want you to think justice is always clean. It isn't. I did not get everything I wanted. Calvin's reduction in the poisoning charge was the thing I had to let go of in a courtroom, while sitting next to my attorney watching something deeply unjust receive a legal category that made it sound almost reasonable. That day was one of the hardest of my life. But here is what I also want to tell you. I am 32 years old. I run my own forensic accounting practice now, started it 18 months ago out of a small office in Chicago's West Loop, with 2 colleagues I trust and a client base we have built carefully and methodically. My daughter goes to a wonderful daycare 3 blocks from my office. On Tuesdays and Thursdays, she is with her father because Calvin has, to his credit, done the work of actually showing up, attending parenting classes, going to therapy, making the appointments and the school events, and the small daily confirmations that a child needs from their father. We do not have a warm relationship, Calvin and I, but we have a workable one, and that is more than I expected. Rosalind is in a federal facility in Indiana. She writes letters occasionally. I keep them in a file and do not respond. People ask me sometimes if I'm angry. And the honest answer is that anger was never really the primary emotion. What I felt for a long time was grief for the marriage I had wanted to have, for the family I thought I was marrying into, for the version of my husband who existed in my hopes and not in reality. Grief is heavier than anger. It takes longer to metabolize. It doesn't have the clean-burning energy that rage does. But I have metabolized most of it now. I look at my daughter sometimes, the way she toddles around my apartment in her socks, completely absorbed in her plastic stacking rings, or her picture books, or the particular mystery of why the dog next door barks every Tuesday. And I think about the night I sat in that bathroom in Naperville with a positive pregnancy test, feeling the ground solidify under my feet. That feeling was not wrong. The ground is solid. It just turned out that it was somewhere completely different from where I was standing at the time. The lesson I took from all of this is not a simple one. It's not trust no one, and it's not blood doesn't matter. The lesson I took is something more specific. Your instincts are data. When something feels wrong, when water tastes different, and eyes smile without meaning it, and your husband comes home repeating his mother's words in his own voice, that feeling is information. Learn to read it, document it, take it to people who can help you build something from it. I was a forensic accountant before any of this happened. I knew how to follow paper trails. I knew that the story behind the numbers was almost never the story on the surface. What I learned from all of this is that the same thing is true of people, of families, of marriages, of the institutions we trust because we're supposed to trust them. There is always a deeper structure. It takes patience and courage and sometimes a very good attorney to find it. But it can be found. My daughter handed me a yellow stacking ring this morning while I was trying to drink my coffee. She looked at me with that already decided face and said, "Mama," with great certainty, as if there was no question in the universe she couldn't answer if she thought about it hard enough. She is 11 months old and she is already right about everything. I do not miss the house in Naperville. I do not miss the chandelier or the beige dining rooms or the careful management of my own presence to avoid taking up too much space. I have an apartment with good light and a kitchen where everything is mine and a daughter who will never once, if I can help it, be made to feel that she needs to make herself smaller to earn someone's approval. That is the only empire that matters to me. And nobody, not Rosalind, not Calvin, not anyone else who decides to underestimate what a woman who reads data carefully is capable of, will ever reach inside it. I want to hear from you now. Have you ever had to protect yourself from someone who was supposed to protect you first? Leave your story in the comments below. If this resonated with you, please like this video and subscribe to Uplifting Stories for more real stories about survival, resilience, and the quiet, unglamorous work of rebuilding a life from the ground up. Your peace is worth fighting for. Every single day, it is worth fighting for.